I would like to welcome our first speakers to the podium, Walter Ruby and Sabeeha Rehman. I'll introduce them briefly. Walter Ruby is a veteran activist in Muslim-Jewish relations who has organized hundreds of winning events bringing together thousands of Jews and Muslims in more than 30 countries around the world. He has served for decades as a reporter and commentator for American, Jewish, and Israeli publications. His articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, Washington Jewish Week, and the Baltimore Sun. He lives with his wife in Frederick, Maryland. Walter and Sabeeha Rehman are co-authors of the book, We Refuse to Be Enemies: How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace, One Friendship at a Time. Sabeeha Rehman is the author of the memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, which was a finalist for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing, received the San Francisco Book Festival Award, and was listed as Top 10 Religion and Spirituality and Top 10 Diverse Nonfiction Books by Booklist. She is a blogger and a public speaker. She is an op-ed contributor to the Wall Street Journal and has published articles in Forward, Salon.com, New York Daily News, Washington Jewish Week, and the Baltimore Sun. She lives with her husband in New York City. Sabeeha and Walter Ruby are co-authors of the book, We Refuse to Be Enemies: How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace, One Friendship at a Time. So as we think about creating our family of believing brothers and sisters in faith, I welcome Walter Ruby and Sabeeha Rehman to the podium. Thank you.
Well, assalamu alaikum, and let me speak, both of us are so happy and proud to be here. This is such a beautiful, beautiful event, and I was very inspired by the Congresswoman's wise words about the common moral imperative in all three Abrahamic faiths, which is, and briefly, I just want to thank all of you, thank Muslims for Peace, Irshad Haji, President Umar Sheikh, Sarah Mach, and so many others who worked hard to make this happen, and also our fellow speakers, Professor Juan Cole and Sayed Jawad Qazwini. So we are here, Sabeeha and I, to, well, let me start it like this. It's a chance, this is a great honor for me and a chance to share my perspective as a Jew in dialogue with my sister, Sabeeha Rehman, standing here. And I call her sister both because we are dear friends and collaborators, but also because we're part of the same family, the Abrahamic family that Sarah just referenced. Thanks. And thank you so much. So we want to talk about, the common roots of that family, how there's been dysfunction in the family, and how we hope and how we feel that it's so important to restitch that family. So starting from the beginning, starting from Aleph, as we say in Hebrew, or Aleph also in Arabic, we have the same patriarch Abraham, and it's always so fascinating to me how Muslims revere all of the Hebrew patriarchs and matriarchs, including Abraham's wife Sarah, and we'll have more on that in this discussion. And Muslims consider Abraham's lineage, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, or Yusuf, to be prophets, as Sarah just referenced so powerfully. And as are other towering figures in Jewish history, such as Moses, who Sarah also referenced, who was mentioned more times in the Quran, I'm told, than is the Prophet Muhammad himself, and the great Hebrew kings, David and Solomon. So we have the same origins, which is a great start, but we've had dysfunction in our relationship, and sometimes it feels to me that we're somehow separated at birth. We have the same forefather, and then things took a different path, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes good ways, sometimes not so good ways. Maybe the whole thing started with the casting out of Hajar and her son Ishmael into the desert by Abraham at Sarah's behest, and we'll speak about that in greater length later. But that started a somewhat complicated relationship. There were issues at the time of the founding of Islam between the followers of Prophet Muhammad and the Jews who lived, the Jewish tribes who lived in the area, and at least on one occasion led to bloodshed. And then, of course, over the past century or so, with the return of the Jews to their promised land and the recreation of the Jewish state in Israel, and that caused the exile of millions of Palestinians, that's also led to a pulling apart, a deepening of the rift and a mutual demonization. So what Sabeeha and I and others in both our communities are about is restitching those ties. We believe that is a necessary and very, very vital work of our own times, something I consider holy work, and that we've been engaged in, Sabeeha and I and others, for much of the 21st century. We need to embrace these common roots, as did the prophets Isaac and Ishmael when they came together after Abraham's death to bury their father together in the cave of the Machpelah, the tomb of the patriarchs, in what the Jews call Hebron and the Muslims El Khalil. We need to embrace and celebrate together our common customs, rituals, and moral principles, and to work together around the world for the benefit of both communities and all of humankind. We must not allow differences over Israel and Palestine to tear us apart here in America, where we have so much to do together. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Last week was the birthday of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Last week was also Yom Kippur, the holiest of Jewish holidays. In that week, I recalled an incident that when Prophet Muhammad had migrated to Medina and had come into contact with the Jewish community, he noticed that the Jews were fasting on the 10th day of the New Year. At that time, the Muslim New Year and the Jewish New Year coincided. So he asked them, why do you fast on the 10th day? And they said, we fast to commemorate Prophet Moses' exodus in leading the Israelites out of bondage. He said, Moses is closer to me than he is to you. And in solidarity with them, he started fasting on the 10th day of the new year. Of course, now it's done here in the Jewish tradition in Passover, but from that point on, Prophet Muhammad would fast on the 10th day. Ashura, Muslims since then have been fasting on the 10th day of Muharram, and that also coincides with the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the Prophet's grandson. This is just one of many examples of respecting one another's tradition and coexistence. Unfortunately, we forget the best and we remember the worst. And in remembering the worst, it has trickled down through the centuries, so that when I was growing up in Pakistan, and of course I had never met a Jew, my impression and perception of Jews was through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Pakistan to this day has not recognized Israel. In fact, my father's passport was stamped, all countries of the world except Israel. And that is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, had you ever met a Muslim?
No, Sabeeha, I had never met a Muslim until well into my 20s. I grew up here in the States, a lonely Jewish child in a predominantly Gentile section of Pittsburgh, a suburb of Pittsburgh, and I was moved at that time by the book Exodus about the founding of the State of Israel. Really inspired me. And then it seemed like almost like a good fairy granted my wish. My father came home a few months later. I'm now 11 years old, and he said, we're going to move to Israel in a few months. And he had a sabbatical year as a physicist at a scientific institute there. So I spent my 6th grade year in Israel. I got incredibly connected to the place and kind of affirmed as a Jew. But at that time, I did not meet any Muslims or Christians, any Palestinians during my childhood. Sabeeha?
The first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to the United States in 1971. Is there an echo? Okay. My husband was a medical resident and he took me to the hospital's Christmas party. Half the medical residents were Pakistani Indian, the other half were Jewish. And these Jewish doctors were being very nice to me, as in, are you feeling lonely? Do you miss your family? We are so happy to have you here. Call us if you need any help. And I had difficulty reconciling my negative perception of the Jews with the reality that I was facing. Then I find out that the upstairs neighbor in my apartment building, the woman who had taken me under her wing and was showing me the ropes, was Jewish. My husband's boss, who was mentoring him and opening doors for him, was Jewish. Then I move into an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Willowbrook, Staten Island. I had no idea what I was getting into. I liked the house, I bought the house, and then I find out that these are Orthodox Jews that I'm living, amongst whom I'm living. My father was visiting from Pakistan, and he said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. This community will be good for your children because they will raise them in a disciplined manner. They are people of principle. And he was right. Not only was he right, but I got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to tell my children why we don't have a Christmas tree and why we don't eat pork. When was your awakening, Walter?
So my awakening happened because I moved back to Israel when I was 26, and I stayed there for 3 years, and I was living in the city of Haifa in northern Israel, and I became a journalist, and I was covering the whole north of Israel. So there were many Israeli Arab, or sometimes Israeli Palestinian, depending on how that's defined. That's an issue that discussed a lot. But in any case, I was covering those communities, and I found out two things. It was a very, very important turning point in my life. First, I realized by covering it that the Israeli Palestinians were being discriminated against, that they did not receive the same resources as in the towns that they were in, as the Jewish towns just right, a couple of kilometers away. So that was an important realization for me, which I hadn't really understood before. But something more important happened, even, I think, in terms of my own life path, which was that by going out there and having those encounters, I just discovered the power, the transformative power of one-on-one human encounters, personal encounters with people you might not have talked to otherwise, or you might have been afraid of, they seem as the other. What happened was that I was so warmly received in those places, and it wasn't just journalist and so, interviewee. It became, they would invite me to dinner, and we would have soulful talks that would go on for hours. And I think they were very moved that I, as a Jew, had come out to their villages to hear their side of the story, essentially, and to encounter them as human beings. So it was very, very important for me. And yet, when I would go back to Haifa and talk to my Jewish friends and also relatives, they kind of, when I would talk in this way, they would kind of be rolling their eyes and they'd say, look, Walter, you're a nice guy, but what you are is a naive American. Like you've only been here a year, and you're like, we've been here, we've lived here our whole lives. We know that the Arabs want to drive us into the sea, full stop, And that was what I was hearing from them. And then I'd say, well, have you been to such and such village? Have you had discussions like this? Well, no, we don't need to do that. We already understand what the Arabs are all about. And one of the people who was saying that was my Uncle Ze'ev, who was a very important influence for me. He was from the founding generation of the State of Israel. I had admired him deeply. He was a lovely person. But he was saying similar things at that point. And so I just want to read a little bit from our book, a couple of lines, which was that I was visiting him and his wife at the kibbutz, and as I went, I was walking in the fields, and I suddenly saw, oh my goodness, this town Ibalin is only 10 miles away maybe, and it's a place where I had met a Palestinian priest named Father Elias Shakur, who was a community organizer and was doing incredible work trying to give a nonviolent alternative to young people who were very angry. He said, let's build our own community center if we don't get the funding. Anyway, so when I talked to, finally I said to my Uncle Zev, I said, have you ever been to Ibalin, where this priest was from? And he said to me, well, of course I have. And I said, well, when were you last there? And he looked and he thought for a minute. He said, well, as far as I recall, I was there in 1943. Now this was taking place in 1977. So when he said 1943, my eyebrows went up, and he said, okay, so it's been a while since I've been there, so what? Don't think for a minute that just because you were there a couple of weeks ago and you got sweet-talked by that priest of yours that you understand the Arabs better than I do. Listen, I don't need to go to Ibalin or meet Shakur or the others you talk to in order to understand what they want, which is to destroy the state of Israel as soon as they can. And one way they're trying to do that is to pull the wool over the eyes of Jewish dreamers like you. So anyway, from all of this, I understood that if we are ever going to come to cease fearing and disliking the other, it's necessary, as I said, to encounter them as individuals, as fellow human beings, and to learn about their lives and their hopes for their children. That is the way to peace and reconciliation, and that is the path that I have tried to follow through the rest of my life. So, Sabeeha?
So that path opened up for me when I was hanging out with my Jewish neighbors by the sidewalk. It was the 1970s. I was a homemaker, raising two boys, and we would be standing on the grass, chatting. And I guess from that grass drew grassroots movement. I must have invited one of them over for dinner, and she may have said, so what are you serving? And we started talking about dietary restrictions, and now we're looking at each other and saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either. And is halal the same as kosher? She may have invited me over for coffee, and I would have said, thank you, but it's Ramadan. Well, what is that? And that's how interfaith dialogue started, literally amongst mothers hanging out by the sidewalk. Thank you. Somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that wouldn't it be nice if my Jewish friends met my Muslim Pakistani friends? Because I didn't want my Jewish friends to believe that somehow I was unique, that I was not like the rest of them kind of Muslims. And I also wanted my Muslim Pakistani friends to meet my Jewish friends and see how nice Jews are. So we would then get together in my living room and, just have some light chatter. And eventually that grew into bigger gatherings, into larger spaces, into public places. So for me, it started from the grounds up. But Walter, for you, it was top down, like hanging out with imams and kings, right?
Well, there was some of that, and the way it all happened was that after the Israeli-Palestinian peace process basically crashed and burned in the early 2000s, I became involved in initially pretty modest efforts to reach out to the Muslim community, try to get involved in Muslim-Jewish coalition building in the US as an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. I was then living in New York, and I believed that we needed a grassroots movement focused on Muslims and Jews speaking directly to each other and connecting on a personal level. And then I had the great good fortune in 2008 to be hired by an old friend, Rabbi Mark Schneier, who was president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. So he hired me. He said, you're going to be my Muslim-Jewish program director here at the foundation. And I stayed at that job for almost 10 years, till 2017. I saw this was my chance to help make this happen. And it turned out to be fantastic, an endlessly fascinating and uplifting job. And it allowed me to travel widely across the US and later internationally. And I organized, as Sarah mentioned, hundreds of twinning events, one mosque, one synagogue, one Muslim-Jewish organization, a Jewish one Jewish student group, one Muslim, bringing them together and trying to get as many of these events going on the same weekend every year, called the Weekend of Twinning. Anyway, I did this for close to 10 years in the US and Europe. And yes, of course, there were challenges, there were setbacks. We'll talk a little about those. But overall, it went much, much better than I had ever imagined possible, which was very gratifying. And it was just so personally fulfilling to bring wonderful people together, grassroots Jews and Muslims, great rabbis and imams who hadn't known each other, to make that connection, to watch them then build on that relationship and move forward together. So that was really a privilege for me. Sabeeha? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Let me tell you then, I want to segue to how Sabeeha and I met, right? Which was about a little over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And as I said, I was working with many Muslim organizations, including the American Society for Muslim Advancement, the ASMA Society, which some of you may remember. And I called over there to Daisy Khan, who many of you probably know, who was the executive director. But Sabeeha answered the phone instead of Daisy. And so Sabeeha was working very closely with Daisy at that time. So Sabeeha and I began talking, we formed a friendly relationship, and then we would see each other at events, quite frequently. But at that point, I think neither of us had any idea where the relationship would go.
Where that relationship went was that in 2016, my book, Threading My Prayer Rug, was ready to be published, and it occurred to me, it would be good to have a blurb from a rabbi, Walter. Walter is not a rabbi, but he worked for one, so I sent him an email. I was in Pakistan at the time visiting family, and I wrote to him and I said, Walter, I've written this book, and do you think that Rabbi Schneier would be willing to write a blurb? And Walter responds and says, I have to read the book. So I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday reading the entire manuscript, writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to write a blurb. And you know what? I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book together? That sounded like a good idea, a bit challenging. So by the time the two of us sat down to talk about, all right, so what are we going to write about? The 2016 presidential elections had taken place, and now we were in a critical crisis mode. And we both felt that our message has to be one of a sense of urgency of how important and Muslims and Jews to come together in the United States and share our experience that interfaith dialogue is important, and it works. We've done it. We've seen its impact. So we decided that we would start off by focusing on the 4 sacred scriptural principles that unite us. The first one is, if you save one life, you save the world. If you take one life, it's as if you have killed all of humanity. Walter was at an event where Hassan al-Askari was being honored for having saved the life of a Jewish young man in the New York City subway station who was being attacked. He was being honored at an event at a masjid, and when the Muslim speaker got up to say that Hassan al-Askari has upheld the Quranic injunction, if you save one life, it's as if you've saved the world, and he says, what? That's in the Torah. I didn't know it was in the Quran. Well, guess what? I didn't know it was in the Talmud. Sorry, not Torah, Talmud. And that was an awakening for me. How much do we not know about one another? And I'm sure many don't know that this is in both our scriptures. And most of us, at the heart of our faith is a commitment to mercy and compassion and the preciousness of everyday life. The second principle that unites us is welcome the stranger. And both Walter and I are a consequence of our mothers being welcomed as strangers. Our mothers were refugees. My mother left India when it was partitioned to make a new home for herself in Pakistan. Walter's mother fled Nazi Germany and made her way eventually over to the United States. My mother had a harrowing journey. His mother had a harrowing journey that lasted many, many months, maybe even a few years. Correct me if I'm wrong, Walter. We talk about that. We detail those stories in the book. My mother was welcomed in the new land, and till her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. Walter's mother became an activist, committed to social services, and doing so much to improve the life of women in America. The third principle that unites us is Islah and Tikkun Olam. Islah as in reform, Tikkun Olam as in repairing the world. These are principles that we both hold dear. Now, it's nice and good to believe that, yeah, we both have the same principles, but it means so much more if we work together on causes to repair the world and to reform the world. It means so much when Muslim and Jewish doctors are standing side by side in health fairs providing medical services to the disadvantaged. It means so much when we both stand side by side, shoulder by shoulder, in the soup kitchens on Christmas Day, serving food to the homeless, where our soiled, gloved hands rub against one another. That is when magic happens. We are not only repairing the world, we are repairing our sibling rivalries. And then the fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. It is a value we embrace. It was a bright, sunny February morning in 2017 when I walked into Times Square and I saw hundreds of people waving posters, "Today I am a Muslim," except that they were not Muslim. They had come there to stand in solidarity and support of their fellow Muslim Americans when the travel ban was issued. This was a Sunday. These people could have been anywhere on their day off, yet they braved the cold and came out there to stand in our support. And then I noticed a 90-year-old woman in a wheelchair could barely lift her head, and I wondered what it took for her to get here. And yet her silent presence spoke the loudest. Not much later, the tide was turned. The Tree of Life synagogue massacre took place, and now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jewish Americans. They showed up for Shabbat. They also did crowdfunding. The goal was to raise $25,000. They raised $238,000. That was standing up for one another. But it hasn't always been easy. And Walter, tell us about some of the issues and challenges.
Sure. But I just to segue off what Sabeeha just said, having, I remember so vividly being at a synagogue right after the killing in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life, and to see all those Muslims who came out, they weren't just showed up, and they were there with us. It was just so incredibly powerful for me. But yeah, it hasn't always been easy, as Sabeeha said. So sometimes we encounter, in this whole process of Muslim-Jewish coalition building, we encounter times when either the Muslim community perhaps pulls back and is resistant, or the Jewish community. And having worked in many cities, I've seen it have sometimes in this city, a certain city it will be the Jewish community, and a certain city a Muslim community. But why does it happen? So I think a lot of it has to do with what we call the two elephants in the room that are there all the time, that we have to contend with. Israel-Palestine, it doesn't surprise you, is the first one, we've had this kind of formulation since the beginning that we can agree to disagree respectfully on certain aspects of Israel-Palestine, but we understand it's so important to build Muslim-Jewish relations here in the U.S. that we are not going to get in. We're going to focus on what unites us, not what divides us. We acknowledge it, we pray together for peace, but we don't necessarily get into a deep debate. That has been our formulation. It's changed a little bit, modified over the years, but what I would see often when I was arranging these twinning events was that there would be every 3-4 years, there were about three or four times during my time I was doing this where there would be upsurges of violence, especially in Gaza. And at that time, I would find the two communities here kind of pulling away from each other. I experienced it because I would be calling the rabbi out in LA and I would be saying, hey, it's September, we're having this event in, the twinning event in November. Have you called the imam yet, the guy you worked with last year? And he would be like, oh my God, he said, Walter, I am embarrassed to tell you that I haven't picked up the phone and made the call. I've just been feeling so uneasy about what's going on and afraid he's going to be very angry. And so I just didn't pick up the phone. And basically, and vice versa. And basically what I would say at that point is you've got to pick up the phone, restart the conversation, and you guys already have a relationship, and I think you'll be able to make it work. And that is what happened, but these things would set us back until people got it together to pick up the phone. The second one is what I call doctrines in our respective holy books that offend the other, sometimes both things from the Torah and things from the Quran. And I want to share with you all that I personally had issues with how the Jews were presented in the Quran, in reading the English translation. And it felt to me that the way that they were presented was kind of like they were sort of being, that there was language to me that sounded like you're saying, you bad boys and girls, everything was done for you, and you were given the 10 Commandments. Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, and you're worshiping the golden calf. What kind of ingrates are you? My goodness, That was how I experienced it. And for a while I was just kind of uncomfortable with it, and then I started talking to Muslim friends, imams, scholars, and basically what almost all of them said to me was, Walter, it says almost the same thing in the Torah. And of course we see that the prophets were saying how disappointed they were with the children of Israel at various times. And I thought about it, I said, they're right. So why am I getting so much more upset about what it says in the Quran than what it says in the Torah? And I realized that, like all of us, I think people of all backgrounds, we experience it. We can criticize our own people. We can make fun of them. We can laugh. We can have comedians making fun of. But if somebody else, God forbid, says the same thing, then they must be anti-Semites. And so I'm sharing that partly to say I got past that, but the only way I got past it was picking up the phone and making the call, and that's really what we really need to do. So we just want to have thank you so much. So we just have a few more points we wanted to share, Sabeeha and I. One is that, I pointed out to Sabeeha that, that location often matters. What we say in Hollywood, they say location, location, location. Sometimes that matters more than actual doctrinal disputes. So, take for example the story in both the Quran and the Torah about Sarah urging her husband Abraham to cast her handmaiden Hajar out into the desert with her son Ishmael, and Abraham, of course, that's Abraham's firstborn son, and out into the desert, and how God showed Hagar well and that they would survive and so forth. But for me, I had that set in Beersheba, in southern Israel, a place that I lived for almost a year when I first moved to Israel in 1976. So I had the picture, because I used to wander out of the place where I was living then, the absorption center. When in my first months there, I'd wander out into the desert. I would be invited into the tents of Bedouins, and we served hot Arabic coffee, and it was but that was my mind. That was my picture of Abraham out there in the desert. And then, of course, in Islam, the tradition is this happens in Mecca, where they find the well. And so Sabeeha and I had a candid conversation in the book about how each of us perceives that and why geography matters.
And when Walter said that to me, I said, whoa, hold it. This is the cornerstone of our faith. It says in the Quran, which we believe is the divine word, about the two hills of Safa and Marwa, about Abraham and Ishmael raising the walls of the Kaaba, of God saying that he will settle his offspring there, of God commanding us to face in that direction when we say our prayers, of coming there and performing the Hajj. That is the that is so central to our being Muslims. And then, if we think about Beersheba and Mecca and Canaan, the journey from Canaan to Mecca was by no means improbable for a camel-riding Bedouin. Mecca is 920 miles from Jerusalem, and that makes for a 9-day journey on a camel, which was no big deal for Abraham, who we know was a traveler. And the wilderness of Beersheba comprised of all the desert regions south of Palestine, including the Hijaz. But then Walter came back with another question, right, Walter? Sarah and Hagar?
Right. So where was that? Yes, so coming back to Sarah and Hagar. So I said to Sabeeha at one point, Muslims must dislike Sarah, given that she pushed Abraham to cast Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert. So I was almost sort of saying, I'm really sorry that kind of we did this to you guys, or our matriarch did this to the Muslim community. And it turned out she had a completely different narrative on this subject, which was revealing to me how little I understood, even though I'd supposed to be involved in all this stuff for a while.
Yeah, so I said to Walter, we don't believe that Sarah threw Hagar out of the house. The Quran doesn't say that. We believe that Abraham took Hagar out into the desert because it was God's command. And that when he left her and Ishmael in the desert and turned to leave, she called out to him and said, "Why are you leaving us here? Did God command you to do that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he will provide for us." So we don't hold anything against Sarah. In fact, we name our children Sarah. We revere her. When we went to the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron, we stood at her graveside and offered the Fatiha prayer for us. And so I said to Walter, I said, let's put that millennial-old perceived conflict between the two women, Sarah and Hagar, to rest. And I will drink to that, non-alcoholic for me. You wanted to talk about the others, respecting the others' narrative, and then we can go into that.
Should I just do the tear down the wall? Okay, so to conclude and stay in the Holy Land for a minute, in Genesis 25 it says, this was the total sum of Abraham's life, 175 years, and he breathed his last, dying at a ripe old age, and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him at the cave of the Machpelah, which I mentioned earlier in Hebron. And so there that's very moving. To me, that's incredibly moving that the estranged brothers came together to bury their father, and it's a symbol of what we might do today. But tragically, at the moment, this common point of veneration of both Muslims and Jews for our common patriarch and matriarchs is very difficult. And so at the moment you have this common. You have the patriarchs and all matriarchs buried together, but you have the Muslim prayer being from one side of they're sealed off from each other. The Jews worship from one side, the Muslims from the other, and this is very tragic. I mention this because last month I was there. I was in Hebron with a delegation of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others from around the world who were working for a group called Project Rosanna, which is trying to build trust and friendship between Israelis and Palestinians through healthcare, upgrading healthcare, for example, transporting Palestinian children with cancer to Israeli hospitals. So there we were all together, and we came down to the tomb of the patriarchs, but the guards, both Palestinian and Israeli, insisted that those of us who were Jews had to go over to that side, and it involved a kind of a walk around the block in a kind of very, difficult, intense area where there's the separation wall, and the Muslims and Christians could enter on the Muslim shrine. So here we had come together, our group of Jews, Muslims, Christians, and we were pulled apart, and that was very painful. A couple of days later, and I'll just finish here, I crossed the hideous separation wall on foot between Israel and the Palestinian lands into Bethlehem. And my Palestinian guide, so you go through this thing on foot, you can come back out on foot. It's very easy for me to go back and forth. It's incredibly difficult for the Palestinians, most of whom are not allowed to go onto the Israeli side. But he showed me, the guide, he said, look, we went up to the wall, which is covered with graffiti and it's, tall and it's ugly. And he said, if you peer through it, just like you have to look through this little crack. And then he said, kind of turn your eyes like this and you can see Rachel's tomb. So Rachel's tomb is a site that's holy again for both faiths, and yet most of the Palestinians can't even get there. And just the irony of looking at that through that crack. And so there's a huge amount to be done. Many walls, both brick and mortar and spiritual walls as well, and psychological walls remain. Our job is to demolish them by connecting with each other here in New Jersey, over there in Israel, Palestine, and around the world. And that is the path of reconciliation and brotherhood. And thank you so much.
So I'll close by just saying a few words about how we, the Abrahamic family, whom God refers to as Jews and Christians being people of the book, whom we have permission to marry, the ultimate in an interdependent relationship. We are cousins in faith. And we are an American family. Yes, we are an Abrahamic family, but we are also an American family. And I will close by reading a brief passage from the book, which was a coming together of an American Abrahamic family. I have never been inside a mosque, Rabbi Weinberg said to Khalid, my husband, right after the 2016 elections. Khalid called the Islamic Center of New York on 96th Street and made an appointment for the rabbi to meet the imam after Jummah prayers. Should I remove my kippah? The rabbi asked as they entered the mosque. Keep it on. The rabbi was very noticeable as a Jewish person. He sat down on the prayer rug beside Khalid, listening to the imam's sermon, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the congregation in prayer. As soon as the prayer was over, people started walking up to the rabbi. Thank you for coming, they said as they shook his hand. A distinguished-looking elderly man dressed in a white shalwar kameez walked up to the rabbi. I would like to give you a gift, but I have nothing on me. Then he held out his hand and showed the rabbi his prayer beads. This is my tasbih. It is a family heirloom, and I would like you to have it. And he placed it in the hands of the rabbi, whose eyes teared up. In those dark days, we witnessed many silver linings. We witnessed the best of America. Wasn't it Martin Luther King who said, "Only in the darkness can you see the stars"? Here in America, the stars had clustered, shining their lights upon people of all faiths who were standing together, the Abrahamic family. Thank you very much.
Yes.